everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. I thought I would never hear myself say this in a video, but you can make some really great lines by completely ignoring scales. And this way of making lines is a great alternative, and it should help you get rid of lines like this. But in the long run, you probably also want to learn your scales and use them in your playing, and I'm going to talk about why that is a little bit later in this video. This is something that I came across while I was analyzing a George Benson solo, because I thought it was fantastic how he could make some really great lines that were skipping around and didn't sound predictable. Actually didn't seem to be using scales. He's thinking in a completely different way, and this way of making lines that I'm going to go over and show you how to implement in your own playing is a great alternative to the traditional way of thinking, where we're thinking in scales and arpeggios, and whenever you play something it seems to have a direction that we already know where it's going. That sounds okay, but it can also get a little bit boring, and this is a great alternative to that. So it's a really simple concept. The idea is to just think in the basic triad of the chord and then use that and leading notes to create some lines that are much more free to skip around, and we're not using scale runs or arpeggio runs in the same way that we normally do. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improve the way that you solo, check out some interesting arpeggios or chord voicings, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. The material that I'm using in this video is really simple. I'm going to demonstrate everything on a 2-5-1 in B flat major, so that's C minor 7 to F7 to B flat major 7. I'm going to focus on using this on the II chord, so on the C minor chord, and it's really going to be based around the C minor triad, so this triad, and then sort of two ways of creating the melodies. One is using enclosures, so that would be this. And then also using a chromatic leading note from below each chord tone. What's liberating about this is that usually when we're making lines, we're thinking in arpeggios and scale runs, and if you're starting something with a scale run and it's going in one direction, then it's difficult to just change the direction, and it's also difficult to skip to somewhere else and still get a strong melody out of it. In this case we have all these small melodies, so we have these sort of leading notes that are really going to the core of the sound of the chord, which is just the basic triad, and then makes it possible to sort of put them together and have lines that move in a much more surprising and interesting way. So the idea is just to use these two exercises to create lines, and if you combine them on a 2-5-1, then you get something like this. The first part of the line is just two leading notes to the third of the chord, so to the E flat, and we have the enclosure around it, so it's F, D, and then E flat. Then we get a leading note to the fifth, so I'm skipping down to the fifth here, but I'm first playing a leading note, then going back up and playing an enclosure of the root, so D, B, and then C. And then on the F7, first we have an enclosure of the third of the chord, so the A, and that's B flat, and then G sharp up to A, and then just running up the arpeggio, and down again, resolving to the third of B flat major 7, which is the D. This example is using the same approach, but also on the other chords in the 2-5-1. So the first part is really just an enclosure of the third of the C minor, so the E flat, and I get first a D and an F, then the fifth of the chord, so G, and then an enclosure of the root, so D, B, and then C, and then I'm adding, it's kind of like just running up the scale, or you want to see it as a leading note to the seventh of the F7, so that's a D, up to E flat on F7, and here we get a leading note to the fifth, so B up to C, then an enclosure of the third, so the enclosure of the A, that's G sharp, B flat to A, and then running down the arpeggio, resolving to B flat on the D, so the third of the chord, then up the triad, and an enclosure of the third up here, which is first E flat, then C sharp, and then resolving. The concept that I'm using here is really that we have all these short melodies that are very clearly resolving to something that's very closely related to the chord. So we have all these leading notes and then they're resolving to a chord tone. On the C minor I'm just using the triad, that's also what I'm using on the B flat chord, and on the F7 I'm just using the basic F7 arpeggio. You could try to do the same thing with extensions, but the problem you run into there is that if you take the extensions, then usually an extension is something that wants to be a leading note, and the leading note to the extension is going to be something that's actually a chord tone. So in that way we don't have something that makes sense in the same way melodically in how the melody is going to flow from something that's related to the chord and something that's really on top of the chord. So if you want to play lines where you're emphasizing extensions, you kind of need to add the context of the rest of the chord, and you're probably better off using something that's more like the traditional way of improvising with scales and arpeggios, so that you can add that context in a logical way. So this approach works well, but you probably also want to combine it with more traditional lines. And the next example is using the same idea on the C minor 7, and then I've added a George Benson line on the F7. The reason that I can keep on publishing videos every week is that I have a community of people over on Patreon that are supporting the channel. I'm very grateful for their support, and it's because of them that I can keep on making all these very specific jazz guitar and music theory videos. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page, and if you join us over on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. In this example, I'm using an extended version of the enclosures, which is really just a way of repeating a few notes and then giving me a longer melody. So on the C minor 7, I'm starting on the 5th, and then we get an enclosure of the E flat, so the 3rd of the chord. And the way I'm doing that is I'm starting above, so on the F, and then running down to the leading note below, but I'm using the chord tone as well, so it becomes kind of a scale run, and then resolving to the E flat. And then we get an enclosure of the root of the chord, so the C, and that's just a D and a B. On the F7, I'm pretty much just using what I would consider almost George Benson's favorite dominant 7th lick, because he's playing on the F7 the arpeggio from the 3rd, so the A half diminished, then down to the root, and then skipping down to the 3rd of the chord, that's an A here, and then going up to the root of the key, so that's a B flat. And then skipping up to the 7th of the chord, so the E flat. And here he can resolve to the 1 chord, so that's resolving down to the D, the 3rd of B flat major 7. And then I've added this tag on it, which is just running down the arpeggios of D, B flat, and then an enclosure of the 5th, which is G and E, resolving to F. If you want to check out some more George Benson, then check out this video where I'm analyzing a phrase from his solo on All the Things You Are and talking about how to incorporate some of the things that he's doing in there into your own playing. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. That's about it for this time. Thank you for watching, and until next time.